And what I've got is the Republicans holding middle-class tax relief hostage because they're insisting we've got to give tax relief to millionaires and billionaires to the tune of about $100,000 per millionaire, which would cost, over the course of 10 years, $700 billion. And that economists say is probably the worst way to stimulate the economy.
Well, that was the president speaking Friday in a televised press conference. His middle-class tax cuts being held hostage, he said. But that's not all. Take a look around. From environmental research to health to housing, our next guest's latest book laid it out pretty clear. In crises, all sorts of human needs are held hostage to other priorities. And worse, once those crises fade, the priorities tend to stay the same. The Shock Doctrine, its author, Naomi Klein, joins me in studio today. I'm happy to say, Naomi, welcome back to Grit TV.
Thanks, Laura. Great to see you.
So what did you make of this whole holding hostage talk from the president on Friday?
Well, he's getting back into election mode, and would have been nice to see more of that earlier. But, you know, when I first saw the clip about $750 billion to $700 billion to millionaires and billionaires, I thought he was talking about TARP, because it was the same amount that they happily handed over to millionaires and billionaires. And that is directly connected to the economic crisis that was created in the public sphere. And, you know, we talked about this at the time. There was a crisis in the banking sector and the financial sector. Rather than solve that crisis, it was moved. It was moved and turned into a budget crisis. I mean, obviously there are many contributors to that budget crisis, but now the bill's coming due. Multiple bills are coming due at the same time, the bills for the wars as well. Just wrong-headed economic policy across the board. But now the time has come to pay, and of course it's the most vulnerable people who are being asked to pay.
And the dialogue hasn't changed from what you just mentioned. You most recently wrote for The Nation magazine after the G20 in Toronto and said you felt like you and your city had been mugged. The G20 left the nations of the world with a mandate to do exactly that.
To do exactly that. And it was interesting because the reporting on the G20 was really very silly. It set out this supposed battle between Obama and some of the European Union governments like Germany, and he was set up as the person who didn't want to cut deficits, that he wanted more stimulus. And he does want more stimulus, but it's more complicated than that, because you also, in terms of the way this country is governed, there is the ability to offload the crisis to the states and the municipalities. And that's where the most dramatic cuts are happening. And so the decision not to bail out the states is really where the pain gets transferred.
Let's hear from one worker. He's an SEIU worker. He was profiled recently on MSNBC. Take a look.
And for a blue-collar person like myself, the supply I have is the money I have that I can spend disposable income, which can create more demand on the system, which can create more jobs. And I don't understand where we've lost track of that when we see wage stagnation as we do see it, and yet we see the CEOs in the upper echelon, the 10%ers in this country, controlling 90% of the wealth. I believe in a more equitable system where we all, in the words of Paul Wellstone, when we all do better, we all do better. And I'd like to see that kind of belief in America once again.
You just love it when you have workers quoting Paul Wellstone on national television. Doesn't happen often enough. Naomi, I listened to him and I heard in his voice a lot similar to what you'd been hearing when you went down to Mississippi after the BP oil spill disaster. A lot of sense of who's looking out for us. You know, we're up against such tremendous odds. Where are you finding hope in all of this? Because you're famous also for finding some examples of people actually figuring out how to meet their needs in these situations.
I think that the fact that that unemployed people in this country are starting to get organized is a real source of hope, because this is, you know, what is so what's so dangerous about just disposing of huge sectors, just pushing them out of the economy, is that they become invisible. And we don't really have political structures to make the economically disposed of people visible, right, so that we know it's happening. And you know, I've done a fair amount of research in developing countries in Latin America, and this move towards organizing unions of the unemployed, marches of the unemployed, that was a really decisive factor in Argentina in 2001, 2002, when that country went through a dramatic transformation. And I've really been waiting to see that happen in this country, and now it's starting to happen. I think that's a source of hope. But look, the problem is there's rage across the board. The right has organized itself very effectively and with frighteningly deep pockets to provide a voice for right-wing, often racist rage. A lot of people on the at the center liberal end of the spectrum spend a lot of time trying to manage rage, particularly around election time, and there really aren't very many outlets to voice progressive rage at the elites, rage at those millionaires and billionaires. And it's a crisis. Yeah. The crisis in this country that comes from the fact that there isn't a real left. There are a lot of institutions that pretend to be an independent left and then turn into an arm of the Democratic Party around election time, and election time in this country seems to never end.
So if we just saw a PSA for the One Nation Working Together demonstration taking place October 2nd that Free Speech is going to be covering. If you were a speaker there, would you have a quick punch for people?
Well, I think that we have to build that independent left. And it has to be so strong and so powerful and so militant and so radical, and that it becomes irresistible. Because when people speak truth like that, and when they hear that rage, their rage reflected, but in a constructive way, so that it isn't channeled towards the most vulnerable people, but actually going up the ladder as opposed to down the ladder, then that builds a movement, and it builds a movement that politicians can't ignore. They can't ignore that constituency, because this model isn't working at all. You know, Bill McKibben wrote a fantastic piece thanking the environmental NGOs in Washington for failing so spectacularly in their stated mission of getting any kind of action on climate change, that now we know exactly what doesn't work. And now we should proceed on the basis of knowing exactly what doesn't work. And I think that applies to a lot of different sectors, not just the environmental sector.
A lot of people, to go back to the Friday press conference from the president, a lot of people were hoping to hear at that press conference that he'd made the decision to appoint Elizabeth Warren as the consumer protector on the financial side. Were you disappointed that that announcement wasn't made?
Well, I hope very much that it does happen. I'm not. Look, this is the person who appointed Larry Summers and Tim Geithner as his chief economic advisors to the most powerful economic positions in the country. So I don't expect him to appoint Elizabeth Warren. But I do think the fact that people are being so insistent on it and pushing back so hard against the smears and misinformation is really important.
Finally, in the New York Times today, there's one story that just shouts out, shock doctrine. Scientists say a lack of cash is hindering research on the environmental impact of all sorts of things, the spill included, because all the money is tied up in the BP reparations debate.
Well, this is connected to the BP reparations debate. The scientists that aren't getting funding are the scientists that are trying to find the oil that the government claims has disappeared. You know, they claim that 75% of the oil has disappeared. This is absolutely not true. They can't see the oil, but they have no idea what has happened to the oil. And the scientists who have been tracking that, and there has been some good science out there from the University of South Florida, David Hollander in particular, went out on a research cruise in August and found that supposedly disappeared oil, or some of it, and it's in the water column. It is not degraded. It's in the sediment. And this is what affects the future fisheries down the road, because the way he put it to me when I spoke to him recently is that we have looked so far at this disaster as a top-down disaster, looking at the top of the food chain, the birds, the dolphins, the large fish. And he said, well, what about if it's a bottom-up disaster, meaning if it's in the photoplankton, if it's in what the fish eat, if it's in the larvae, then the effect of that is something we won't know now for years. So how do you assess what your reparations are if you have absolutely no idea what the genuine damage is? And it's scandalous that they're not funding that research.
Naomi Klein, you can find more information and her writing at our website, grittv.org, and of course at thenation.com.